on the question of property rights by accord, my theory of property rights. Now, the theory of justice that I've been developing and that you've been studying on and off over the last several weeks asks you to think about social justice in a very different way. It asks you to think about property rights, regulation, taxation, and the redistribution of income in a very different way. As you remember, I've rejected the social contract idea that there is an approximation of a contract to which everyone agrees. Not only have we failed in the most basic way of fulfilling that contract, but in a real way, we have in an important way, we can't fully, we cannot fully fulfill it, I don't believe, ever. And I've given you several reasons for that. So we do not have a social contract. So you have to think about, if we don't have a social contract, then we have people I call dissenters, people who have a rational, reasonable, fully informed disagreement with prevailing social arrangements. One thing I haven't mentioned is that they could think that they don't have an objection, but actually have an objection. Could be people who are oppressed, but have accepted the rhetoric of the insiders that tells them that they're not acceptable. So you have dissenters who know they're dissenters, and you have dissenters who don't know that they're dissenters. And I suppose you could have also people who actually say they're dissenters, but actually really secretly do not. Now, so you've got all these possibilities of dissenters, and all three of those different things are important. You have a social contract which favors insiders and not outsiders, and that is an intractable problem. You will not fix that problem. What we have to do is minimize the damage from that. And what I've argued is ever pursue getting as many possible people into accord, into agreement, at least a majority. That's the most you can ever be sure of, is a majority. But then never stop pursuing it with the outsiders and minimize your negative interference with outsiders by providing a basic income and excellent civil rights and basic services and or maybe more than basic services, and things like that. But I'm also asking you to think differently about property rights. It has become, in the last few centuries, very normal to think of private property as some kind of natural right. A weird kind of natural right, because some of us have it and some don't. And the ones who don't will say, oh, you're equal because, well, you could buy property from these people. Well, you could if you trade your labor with these people, and you can, but that makes you effectively forced to pay your labor because human beings have needs. And if you control the things that they need to satisfy their needs, you will have power, not just over the things, but over the people. So people don't have at least some direct and independent access to resources. They're not there. But that's really not all to my critique of property, because that's not all to my critique of property, because also I do not accept the idea of Lockean appropriation, that somehow there's this natural right to take the earth and make it yours. Very few people in history have believed that is true, and it really begins with propagandists such as John Locke, who knew that most of the world didn't have that kind of property rights system, including the peasants of Europe, and portrayed it as natural anyway. So I'm asking you to think differently about property. If property isn't some natural right, then it is a socially created right. It's also not merely power over things. Property rights is not even primarily power over things. Property rights is power over other people. When you say this resource or this thing that's made out of resources is mine and not yours, you're imposing a duty on the rest of humanity to say, I get to stop other people from using this thing. You're imposing a duty on other people. That is the most essential part of property. So we have to impose this duty on other people. And if you're going to impose duties on other people, you should obtain their agreement and somehow pay for the duties you're imposing on them. Now, it's not always going to be possible to obtain everybody's agreement, as I've argued, but it is possible to pay them. So the justification for the basic income is both to minimize interference with people by preserving their status freedom, but also pay them for the fact that these duties are imposed on them. But these duties, the rights of property, are entirely socially created. None of them are natural, which means that they should be created by agreement. And so all of what is property is subject to agreement. There are at least three kinds of property. Property can be public. It can be owned and managed by the government in a way that but still used for particular purposes. Our schools are public property. Well, our state-run schools anyway. And we can have private property, which we're all familiar with. We can also have common property, which common property might officially, in many cases, be owned publicly. But it's actually, the difference is in the use. And the use is very different. I can't simply go into a third grade classroom and sit there. I don't have the right to be there. It's a third grade classroom for people who are eligible for third grade, and it'd be kind of weird if some strange adult just walked in there and said, "Oh, it's public property. I'm going to hang out here." I'd be really suspicious of that guy who did that. But there is property where I'm allowed to do that. The oceans, the rivers, the lakes, the parks, the highways, the rights of way, that is common property. Property that we can all use, but none can take for our own property. That is common property. When we evolved here, initially, the whole world was a commons. We didn't have the institution of private property. Somehow we had to create this institution of private property or public property. And we've got to think about what we want. Then we got to think about what we want to do with the property of this earth. So we've got to ask, which resources do we privatize? Which do we hold public? Which do we hold in common? If we privatize them, at what price do we privatize them? Where the people who own compensate the people who do not own. But there's so much more to it than that, because when we make property public, private, or common, it's got to be on certain terms. The ocean is common property, and the highway is common property. But the rules for how you can use them are very different. You can't be on a highway without a motorized vehicle. You will violate the rules for how we share out this property. And the rules of a park are different than an ocean or a lake or a land. And a city park has different rules than a nature preserve out in the wilderness. And they also have different than, say, a common hunting and grazing ground, which a lot of societies in history have had, and most Western countries have gotten rid of all of these kinds of things. We had them in the United States really up until after the Civil War, and then gradually got rid of all these common lands that people could just hunt, gather, fish, farm, and graze on. And in most of Europe, they got it a little bit earlier, but not that much earlier. Common land can be done in a different way, but privatized land can be done in a different way. Is the land zoned? Can you build a skyscraper on this land, or are you allowed only to build a single family dwelling on this land? Can you pollute on this land? This land is by the river. Does owning land by this river mean that you could dump all the waste you want into the river? Or does it mean you use it in such a way that it dumps zero waste in the river? Or you can dump these kind of waste and not both. And as a property owner by the river, do you have a right to clean water coming down from upstream? Or can you expect that the people upstream have certain rights to use to do that with this river that adjoins your land? There's so many different rules we could make. We could say, if you're going to build a skyscraper, there has to be a public restroom on the ground floor that everyone can use 24 hours a day. You got to keep it clean and safe. We don't do that with our skyscrapers, but we could. If we did that, it would change the price of skyscrapers. All of these things are to be negotiated, and none is the natural starting point. Even though common property has existed longer than the other types, it is still not a natural starting point, because if you wanted to maintain the commons across the whole world, you would have to interfere with a lot of things that people want to do that would involve creating public or private property. So there is no natural starting point. So the solution I'm giving is that the majority makes the rules. It makes people pay the maximum they can get away with for the property they want, and uses that money, maybe others that any other money wants, to compensate people for the fact they didn't get the way. So you are paying for the property you own, and you're receiving for the property you don't own. You're paying taxes, and you're receiving basic income. There might be other taxes that go for services and other things, or just go to do valuable things like maintain currency without maintain the value of currency so you don't have hyperinflation. That's really the main function of taxes. You're paying for what you own, getting paid for what you don't own. Some pay more than others. If you own more than an average amount of property, you're going to pay more than you receive. If you own less than an average amount of property, you're going to receive more than you pay. That's your reward. If you are a net recipient of the basic income on this planet, it's your reward for being a below average resource user. You own, control, use, and use up fewer resources than everybody else. And so you're consuming essentially services. You're not using, well, you might be saving that money, but if you're not using that money for resources, then you're using it for services provided to you by people who have more. So this really reverses the system of property we have now, whereas those of us without property are born in a situation where we will die if we don't provide some services directly or indirectly for the people who own the property of the world. Now the people who own the property of the world have to somehow improve the value of that property by providing a service and give you the money that you can buy that service. This compensates you for having less. If you pay more than you receive, that is your fee for getting your way. Now, you haven't completely gotten your way. You probably wanted to pay less for this land. You probably wanted different regulations, but you chose to trade your services for this land under these terms, this land and resources and all the things we made out of it, under the terms that were set for you by the hopefully duly elected representatives of the people. So you have voluntarily chosen to trade your labor services for the resources you control. And the other people, some of them have all accepted, yeah, I'm glad to accept this basic income and compensation for the fact that I have less. Other people might say this basic income is too small. No, you should not be able to privatize all these resources under these rules and these regulations and these forms of inequality. You shouldn't be able to do that, and I object to it. The best we can do for those people is say, well, we're going to give you not only basic income that's high enough to maintain your status, freedom, and the way of argument in the past, but we're going to give you the highest sustainable basic income to say everybody can't get their way. I know you like things different, but this society maximizes the amount that we can compensate people who don't get things their way. That's what we do for you. We do the best that we can for our dissenters, and that's what we try to do to minimize our negative interference with them. Not only protect their extra freedom, but also compensate them at the highest sustainable level for the fact that they are below average at controlling, using up resources. And of course, we have other responsibilities. We have responsibilities towards the disabled, the people who can't take care of themselves, and a fiduciary responsibility towards further future generations. If none of us wanted to have kids, we would have no responsibilities for future generations. We could just destroy the whole earth if we wanted to, but that's not going to happen. Future generations will come into existence. We've got to leave an environment that they can live in. We got to be good stewards of the environment. We have that fiduciary responsibility. So that has to be calculated in this. If we can do these things, we are pursuing justice as a core. We are minimizing the negative interference with centers, and we are, as much as we can, trying to approximate property rights by general agreement. That's what I'm proposing as an alternative property system to those that follow from natural rights property theory or social contract. And one more thing before I turn it over to the discussants. In chapter 10 in my book, which is on the reading list, it's pick and choose, so you don't all have to have written it. But in that, I say quite a bit more about this. And well, you've got a lot of readings in mine, so you know there's quite a bit more. But in that, I talk quite a bit more about this, and you're welcome to look at it further. But I'm going to try to keep it short today. But I'll do one more thing, which is give you an illustration of like the difference between the theory that I'm talking about and any other theories. Okay, so let me share screen. Okay, I'll share the screen, and then I will give a presentation. All right, there we go. This is a model of three models of property rights systems. And of course, the question is, which one of these things makes people freest? And of course, is the one that I prefer. Okay, so this is a model of a libertarian sort of a Lockean-based property rights system. Before trade, you have the world carved up between some big wealthy property owners, this bigger, smaller ones, and everybody else is effectively out in space. They have really no right to the earth on which they were born until they go and make an agreement with all these property owners that says, yes, here's some stuff you can make food with. Here's some stuff you can make your house with, or you can even provide more services and I'll get you an actual house. So we begin in this horribly disadvantaged place to trade with the people who own property rights that have been assigned to them by governments in the past. Now, John Rawls' liberal egalitarian version of private property before trade really makes the entire world up for rent for public purposes, but puts us all under the responsibility that we're sort of out in space until we work for the joint project, this supposedly mutually beneficial sort of social contract-based system that he has, and if we're not, we won't do that. He calls us a lazy surfer who surfs off Malibu and isn't entitled to public funds. Once you participate, then you get the highest sustainable wage or compensation if you're unable to work, to minimize the maximum disadvantage of people who participate. But the non-participators are not entitled to public funds. In the system I'm proposing here is that everybody is entitled to a little piece of earth. Like the Irish song goes, save a piece of this island for me. Everybody's got a piece of their island that's for you. It's not be physical. We might give you cash instead of the actual piece. But with the cash, you can rent a place, anywhere you want. Well, preferably on earth, but in your own country, we're stuck with this nation state system. You have certain public spaces. You've created parks and schools and things that are only used publicly. But then you have this area for rent. And if you want to become a rich person, you just say, okay, yeah, I'd like to do this and that service, and I will make this up. And what that means is you participate in the economy, you get lucky, you make a lot of money, you pay your tax. And then your reward comes from these extra resources. That reward goes, and then we end up in a system where we have some inequality, we have some people with some big areas, we have people with some small areas, but nobody is out in space at this point where they have a right to nothing and have to go and serve somebody in order to participate. That doesn't mean I'm against participation. There are people who say, oh, you're against work. I am not against work. To accuse somebody who says we should all choose whether or not to work of being opposed to work is akin to accusing someone who opposes rape of being opposed to sex. I am strongly opposed to rape. I am strongly in favor of sex. I am strongly opposed to forced labor, even indirect forced labor by threatening people with poverty. I'm strongly in favor of labor whenever people can come to a mutually agreement where one person or group decides to hire another person or group to work for them. That's totally cool by me, as long as everybody agrees. And these rules, the rules have to be written in a way that balances a couple of issues. If you want property on the same terms as somebody else, you got to be able to. The agreement can't be, well, we just like to give property to Lutherans. Okay, no Calvinists get property. Lutheran churches will cut you a really good deal on the property. Calvinist churches, bad deal on the property. No, can't be that. If you're using the property in the same way and not creating any more environmental or social damage for other people, you have the same right to property as everyone else. That giving property has to be secure, but also the regulations have to be subject to change because we don't know what the future holds. When we first invented radiation, we didn't know it was harmful. We thought it was energy giving, and we let people do lots of crazy stuff with radiation that ended up killing a lot of people through cancer and radiation poisoning. We got to make the rules changeable, but you also have to trade that off against two things. You have to have changeable, revisable rules, but you also have to have changeable, revisable rules, but also you have to have security for the people who have done what you asked them to do. Once somebody has gone through the effort, said, okay, you said I got to do this to get property. You said I do this, that, and the other thing. I followed the rule. I was playing along. I did the stuff you said, and I accumulated this property. Now you want to take it. Well, there's got to be some trade-off between that. We got to make it revisable if things go wrong, but we can't just completely disappropriate people who have played under the rules for the time being. And that's, of course, not a new idea. That was Jeremy Bentham's argument about the extent to which private property created a constraint for utilitarian theory over 200 years ago. So that's not a new idea, that these two things have to balance out. All right, so let's go to discussion. Let's see. Which discussant is ready to speak?
I'm ready to speak.
What?
I'm ready.
All right, go ahead, Marvin.
I think it was Andrea for
Okay.
for the property theory. So I want to start with really clumsily wrapping up the argument, how I understood it. It's basically that we are, as a society, no matter in which, on which level we define it, we are endowed with certain natural resources and property. And the way it is distributed now is unfair and unnatural. And what came to me when I read these chapters was that essentially we already have a system to deal with this unfairness, and that the state, which is technically the manager of like all these public resources and endowments, that's kind of the system that we came up with over many centuries, how to equalize the distribution. So while the initial argument makes a lot of sense to me that like we should all be entitled to our share of these natural resources, I'm not sure if what follows from it is necessarily an argument for unconditional basic income, because it could be as well an argument for a different form of taxation.
Okay, that's it.
That would be my first.
Yeah, well, from the property rights theory alone, I think that's correct. From the idea of people who get things their way should compensate people who don't get things their way. Then there are a number of ways you can cash that out. The compensation could come in the form of cash, but of course it could come in the form of public goods, some other kind of spending. That's what Henry George suggested in the 1870s, when he had a similar idea, which is a little more concerned with the so-called value of resources and less concerned with agreement, the duties, and less concerned with the many different ways we could privatize resources. But he thought all of that money should be used for public services. But part of that was because he believed that simply by doing this, the tax alone, he argued, would actually do a lot to end poverty and misery itself and create a society that was a little more equal based on what you do and instead of what you own. And I think there's some right in that. And there's this whole tradition that follows from Henry George, which actually goes back to Thomas Paine, which is called left libertarianism. And Philippe's real libertarianism and my justice of the pursuit of court, or independentarianism, as I call it, those are kind of offshoots of this. But when we look at it, I look at it quite differently than Reich. But is that I look at it as a much more complex situation. And the more complex it gets, the less it is that anything but cash is going to help you out. First, because of the need to protect your status freedom. When you bring that in, that's a constraint. And pretty much it has to be cash, either that or you've got to get an apartment, and you got to get an apartment in kind and food in kind and actually deliver your needs in kind. And even then, it doesn't give you the flexibility you might need. But also the public services might not always compensate you. The public services could be, okay, a public service, well, I need, good schools, good healthcare, good roads, but actually, well, I don't know, the roads, that can be controversial. Some of us believe that actually a road system really isn't very important. What we need is a good public transit system. Some of us think that the government should subsidize opera. Other people think the government should subsidize American football. Well, nobody seems to really think that, but nobody seems to say that. But actually, in the United States, we spend a lot more money subsidizing football than we do opera. And so they could say it's not really good to say, look, we have all these public services. We built this stadium that we gave away to the public football team. So and that makes the city so happy. Lots of people voted in favor of that. Go, I don't like football. I don't like you using my public funds that could go to something I actually want, making this football stadium. And I think we do need public goods, and there's going to be disagreements about them. That's why some portion of it has to be in cash to compensate for the fact that you might object to the kind of public services that you're actually getting delivered. That's my response to you. Does anybody else want to talk about this issue before we go to the next discussant? Okay, all right, let's go on to the next discussant then. So let's see, who was the next discussant? This is from like a week ago. We put this off, so let's see. Yeah, it's Andrea. Andrea, you there?
I haven't seen her today.
Yeah, I think.
So she's on. No, that's Alexandria. Oh, I think I got an email from her just before class when I had no time to look at it, and it might have said, I'm not sharing my screen now. Okay, this could be private. Okay. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So Andrea she sent me an email right before class. I had no time to read it, saying that she's unwell today and that therefore she's going to give her discussant comments in a written form. And I have them right in front of me. I've never read these before. So this is me reading the discussant off the cuff. All right, so here we go. This is Andrea Martinez on my property rights here. I believe that the proposal of general agreement is, if not the best, very close to the best option that we could have a fair and equal distribution for each individual. Well, good news to me, okay. I, however, have a question about the Walrasian auctioneer option for the property rights for general agreement, if that were the case of the auction. Okay, I gave a very short presentation. This is stuff I've worked on for 15, 20 years, and some of it's in print, not all of it is, and the print part talks about a wager and auctioneer. I didn't bore you guys with this. Maybe I should have, since you're all masters in economics. That might have been easier for you than some of the ethics stuff. But anyway, she says, so in the case of, I'm talking about in a hypothetical first best agreement, you have everybody saying, would I privatize this resource on these conditions at this price? And then you got, and somebody else saying, would I buy this resource that was privatized at this price? And then imagine an auctioneer adjusting prices and terms of ownership until we get a perfect match for all the resources in the earth, which is of course impossible, but that's the ideal that we're trying to approximate. How would it be able to perform? Would it be similar to electoral votation? Would there be some sort of campaign success that all individuals involved are well informed about what is being sold, and hence they actually can manage its proper value? Okay, now these are good comments because these have gone right to the heart of the less developed parts of the theory. So I am not sure how to work this out. This is where Rawls often, and this says he will just punt on stuff like this by saying that's for the legislative phase. What I'm doing is building a broad outline, and a lot of the details have to be filled in by the legislature at any given time. And so whenever there's something difficult for him to say, how should it go? Oh, that's for the legislative phase. So I give you the broad outline. And I think that's, to some extent, that's fair. Because all a political theorist can do is give a broad outline. They have to leave things for people to decide day to day based on day-to-day circumstances, but it can also end up being a cop-out. It can be a cop-out because you can dodge really important biblical questions that way. And that is something I want to develop more in the future when I actually write a book on the property theory. Right now I have a chapter and a couple of articles here, not as fully worked out as the freedom issue, where there's an entire book on that plus articles. So ideally, you would have people who are, you would have coalitions of people who are sort of sellers and coalitions of people who are buyers, and maybe having a negotiation, but that might not be possible. It might end up being that the only thing possible is to get a majority agreement. Often 51% coalition is possible and a 60% coalition is not possible. The United States has created the most bizarre law where you have to get 60% of the Senate to pass any kind of legislation, with a few rare exceptions. And what they've created is an enormous status quo bias, where if you like things the way they are and don't want them to change, great for you. But if you're oppressed by the way things are, it's almost impossible to get them to change. So in the end, it's got to fall to the 51%. But of course, that gives the 51% a lot of power. And that trade-off is something that we can build some institutions to try to deal with it. Say the people who are, people can join a coalition, you've got to listen to them, but at some point you've really got to let them rule. And that's a difficult thing for the theory. But that's also why the reason that I'm convinced we will never have, it's one of the many reasons I'm convinced we'll never have a society that really approximates a social contract in which there are no dissenters. Would there be some sort of campaign such that all individuals involved are well informed about what is being sold and hence they actually manage its proper value? That is something we can at least do something about. We can much better educate people. We very often will do the very opposite, where the government privatizes something and tries to keep it out of the public debate so they can give it to favored individuals at the cheapest possible rate. In the United States, about 20 years ago, they gave away an enormous part of broadcast spectrum to digital broadcasters, cell phone companies, and a few other people that were using new digital platforms. And they portrayed it not as a government giveaway to particular people who were then going to use this scarce resource, the broadcast spectrum, and sell it back to us. But they portrayed it as just a technical thing. We're just a technical thing about where the TV is going to, which part of the broadcast spectrum will be for digital TV, which will be for the internet, which will be for your cell phone. And they gave it away for almost nothing, the private insiders, and most people weren't even aware that it goes on. This is something that we can teach in schools. This is something that we can educate people about, and we can do better. We can never force everybody to pay attention to things, but we can educate them better so they have some idea of the value of these things. So yes, so she goes on, okay. In my opinion, the biggest problem with everyone collectively deciding on the value of the resource that's about to be privatized is the lack of information about the consequences of privatizing this resource. For example, people from the west of the US might not be fully aware of the use and value of the resources from the east. People from Texas might not be correctly valuing the resources from New York City, Chicago, Seattle, simply because they did not grow up seeing the environment and therefore might know little, but not enough about to place accurate value on it. Nevertheless, as I understood, you proposed that they all hold a vote on whether leasing or not, which I believe could lead to a majority agreeing to privatize the resources that should actually stay free for all. That is, I think, another problem too. Very nice of her to use examples from my country instead of her country or Germany or something. It made it easy for me to understand. I think that is a weakness of the theory. And to some extent, though, that balances out because people from Seattle will be voting on New York, which then they're 3,000 miles apart, and people in New York will be voting on Seattle. So to some extent, they have things to balance out. However, it might be best to reserve some things locally. One of the things that I didn't mention is that your preferred solution should always be somebody gets some area where they can do things their way. That instead is saying, so let me give an example. Some people like to walk in the Black Forest. Other people like to mountain bike in the Black Forest. Other people like to ride motocross off-road motorcycles in the Black Forest. And they can't all do this on the same trail at the same time. But we could get everybody in there. And then some people might like the Black Forest to be just a nature reserve where humans don't go, and we just have a natural environment up there. So Wolves can live free. We bring that to wolves. So the first solution should be everybody gets something their way. So carve out a little space for the people who like to ride motocross bikes. Carve out some space for the people who like bicycles, and carve out some space for the people who like to hike, and carve out a big nature reserve. That should be based on how much space do they actually need to do this stuff. If we divided it equally in 4, the wolves wouldn't have enough space, and the motorcycles would have way more space than they need. Figure out a way they can all. That's your preferred solution, but that's not going to work for everyone. We have some people who want to abuse their children, and other people that don't think any child in the world should be abused. We can't just say, okay, well, go to this part of the Black Forest, and that's where you can abuse your children. Oh my God, no, we cannot let them do that anywhere. And if that makes them a dissenter, if they like beating children and says God has told them not to spare the rod, too bad for them. We'll give you basic income. Okay, it's not going to completely, it's not going to completely compensate you for the fact that you can't beat your children, but that's the best we're going to do. That's all you're getting out of us. Sorry. So you first try division and then compensation. So that's my solution for that. That's my solution for that one. It's one of the best. Okay. Also, related to that point, you mentioned the People's Endowment chapter, the example of oil and the privatization not always leading to the benefit of all individuals in that territory. Just to add a little bit more on that, still in 2021, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Canada have the biggest reserves of oil. With that in mind, I think we all have a great example of that greatly unfair and inestimable environment. Anyway, that greatly unfair and environment that can be created with the destiny of the most important resource and income channel of a country falls in the wrong hands. Oh, well, what happens if this greatly valuable thing falls in the wrong hands? The wrong private or public hands. Private in the case of ExxonMobil, public in the case of Saudi Arabia. Okay, so-called public. Okay, it's more family than a public. Anyway, I'm embellishing her words, but anyway, get it. I'm reading this as I go. Therefore, I am positive that a model that you propose, including the general agreement, is needed to protect future generations, equal treatment and fairness, as well as the future of the environment. Oh, well, thanks. Nice for to say that. Even though it is not yet clearly how to satisfy each individual needs and protect their freedom without being unfair to some other, I believe the model is pretty close to this goal. And it clearly shows us the significant negative effect that private property models have had through the history for individuals. All right, that's her comments. Would anyone else, aside from me, who already has, like to respond to her comments or her comments first before any other aspects of my theory? The other issue on that is that the equal division is not going to be possible for other reasons. Sometimes there's not going to be equal division because somebody's doing something that's just completely morally objectionable, like abusing their children. But the other times they're going to be not division. Suppose, I mentioned people who want to use the Black Forest in several different ways. Suppose there's also just a few people who don't just want to ride motorcycles up there. They want to ride all-terrain vehicles up there, which of course need a really wide space. And the rest are like, there's not very many of you. Black Forest is a pretty delicate environment. Oh, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to use any of this space for that. However, we have this space in Thuringia. We have a space over there in Thuringia that we've carved out for people who like this. You go there. That's part of the things. And your basic income, that's one of the things we give you to help you. Okay, you go over there, you go to, you have to go to Thuringia, you can't go as much off. Well, we're helping out a little bit. That's the kind of thing that it's supposed to do.